Cause, a principle, aim, or movement that because of a deep commitment, one is prepared to defend or advocate. Karibu. Karibu is a Kiswahili word that means welcome. Welcome, you found yourself in a peaceful place, a place where you can grow and develop, and we hope grow and develop to your fullest potential. This is a podcast that we hope will expand your mind and raise your consciousness. Welcome to The Cause, conversations on music, history, and democracy. The Black folk song, the rhythmic cry of the slave, stands today not simply as the sole American music, but as the most beautiful expression of human experience born this side the seas. W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk, 1903. From sorrow songs to freedom songs, from memory to movement, the spirituals still sing. Welcome to The Cause, conversations on music, history, and democracy. I'm your host, Dr. Reiland Rabaka. Every people leaves behind a record of its journey. Some leave monuments carved in stone. Some leave libraries filled with books. Some leave constitutions, court decisions, and political declarations. Enslaved African Americans left all of these in time. But before many of those things became possible, they left songs. Songs carried what chains could not contain. Songs carried memory when memory itself was under assault. Songs carried dignity when dignity was denied. Songs carried hope when hope seemed irrational. Songs carried visions of freedom long before freedom appeared on the horizon. Today we explore one of the most profound artistic traditions in human history, the spirituals. Not merely religious songs, not merely folk songs, not merely historical artifacts. The spirituals are a people's philosophy set to melody. They are theology sung rather than written. They are historical testimony transformed into sound. They are communal memory made musical. They are artistic responses to one of the greatest catastrophes in modern history, the transatlantic enslavement of African people and the centuries of racial slavery that followed. But the spirituals are not simply about suffering. Indeed, one of the most remarkable achievements of the spirituals is that they transformed suffering into something larger than suffering. They transformed grief into beauty, fear into faith, isolation into community, pain into possibility. The spirituals emerged from circumstances designed to crush the human spirit, but they became one of the world's most enduring affirmations of human creativity, resilience, and dignity. To understand the spirituals is to understand something essential about African American history. To understand the spirituals is to understand something essential about American history. And perhaps most importantly, to understand the spirituals is to understand something essential about the human condition itself. Because these songs ask questions that transcend time and place. They are timeless. Questions such as, how do people survive the seemingly unsurvivable? How do they preserve their humanity amid dehumanization? How do they create beauty in the midst of brutality? How do they imagine freedom when living in bondage? And how do they continue to sing? Once again, welcome to the Cause Podcast. Today's great cause is the spirituals, the Black sacred song tradition. The story of the spirituals begins long before the first spiritual was ever sung. It begins in Africa. It begins among people whose history stretched back centuries before the rise of the United States. Too often, discussions of slavery begin with enslavement itself. But African history did not begin with slavery. African civilizations flourished long before European conquest and colonization. The men, women, and children carried across the Atlantic Ocean came from societies rich with languages, religions, philosophies, political traditions, artistic practices, and musical cultures. They came from East and West Africa, Central Africa, North and South Africa. They brought with them memories of collective singing, sacred ceremony, rhythmic complexity, oral storytelling, and communal performance traditions. They carried musical knowledge. They carried spiritual knowledge. They carried cultural knowledge. The slave ship could separate families. It could sever communities. It could attempt to erase identities, but it could not completely extinguish memory. Across generations, fragments survived. Rhythms survived. Melodies survived. Ways of moving, dancing survived. Ways of praying survived. Ways of imagining the relationship between humanity and the sacred survived. The transatlantic enslavement violently uprooted millions of Africans. Those who survived the Middle Passage entered a new world structured by racial slavery. They entered a world that sought to transform human beings into property, a world that measured value in profit, a world that attempted to reduce persons to labor. But even within these brutal conditions, enslaved Africans and their descendants engaged in one of history's most remarkable acts of cultural creation. They made a people. They made a culture. They made a tradition. And among their greatest creations were the spirituals. The spirituals emerged not from a single moment, not from a single place, not from a single individual. They emerged collectively. They emerged gradually. They emerged through generations of struggle, adaptation, creativity, and communal survival. In this sense, the spirituals belong to no single composer. Their composers were the people. Before the road had a name, before the nation learned its own contradictions, before freedom was a promise printed on paper and denied in practice, there was a voice. Not a single voice, a gathering of voices, a field becoming a choir, a wound becoming a witness. To understand the spirituals, we must understand the world that produced them. The plantation was not simply an economic institution. It was a total social system. It shaped labor. It shaped family life. It shaped movement. It shaped education. It shaped religion. It shaped every aspect of existence. Enslaved people worked under conditions of constant surveillance and coercion. Families could be separated through sale. Violence was ever present. Literacy was often prohibited. Political rights were non-existent. The law frequently recognized the rights of owners while denying the humanity of the enslaved. But oppression never achieved complete control. We should be clear about this. There were always spaces of resistance, always spaces of creativity, always spaces where human beings asserted their dignity. One of those spaces was music. Music accompanied labor. Music accompanied worship. Music accompanied mourning. Music accompanied celebration. Music accompanied survival itself. The spirituals emerged from these everyday realities. They gave voice to experiences that could not always be spoken openly. They created a shared language through which enslaved people could interpret the world around them. They offered emotional release. They offered collective affirmation. They offered spiritual sustenance. And perhaps most importantly, they offered hope. Not naive optimism, not wishful thinking. Hope. A disciplined belief that the world as it exists is not the world as it must remain. You know, one of the greatest misconceptions about the spirituals is that they emerged simply through the adoption of European Christianity. The reality is far more complex. The spirituals emerged through cultural encounter, adaptation, reinterpretation, and transformation. You see, that's the conceptual framework. That's something that we should keep in mind as this discussion unfolds. African musical traditions profoundly shaped the development of the genre. One of the most important contributions was this thing that we call and response. Call and response. A leader sings, the community responds. A voice rises, many voices answer. This pattern remains one of the defining features of African American music across the centuries. Call and response is more than a musical technique. It is a social philosophy. It reflects an understanding that individual identity emerges from community, that the self is strengthened through participation, that expression becomes meaningful through relationship. Another enduring contribution was rhythmic vitality. African musical traditions often emphasized layered rhythms, bodily participation, collective movement, and active engagement. Music was not something separate from life. Music was life. Music accompanied work. Music accompanied worship. Music accompanied social gatherings. Music accompanied healing. These sensibilities survived in African American culture. Even where drums were prohibited, rhythm remained. Hands clapped, feet stomped, bodies moved. The human body itself became an instrument. Improvisation also played an important role. The spirituals were not static compositions. They evolved. They changed. They adapted. Individual singers added variations. Communities developed distinctive styles. The songs lived because they could grow. This creative flexibility would later become a hallmark of blues, jazz, gospel, soul, funk, reggae, and rap music. The genealogy of African diasporic music and African American music in particular begins here. The song rose where iron believed itself eternal. It rose where cotton drank the daylight and the body bent toward the earth, while the spirit leaned elsewhere toward horizons no overseer could fence. Listen, not with the ear alone, but with that older chamber of knowing, where memory sleeps lightly, where ancestors keep watch like lamps, hung at a distance, away from bad weather. The song says, I am older than this plantation, older than this auction block, older than the language that names me property. I arrived carrying rivers. I arrived carrying drums hidden in bone. I arrived carrying stories folded inside the dark bread of memory. The spirituals are deeply rooted in Christianity, but they represent a distinctly African American interpretation of Christianity. Enslaved people encountered biblical stories through the lens of their own lived experience, their own lives and struggles. Not surprisingly, certain biblical narratives resonated with particular power. The story of Exodus became central. The Israelites enslaved in Egypt, Moses confronting Pharaoh, the long journey toward freedom. These stories spoke directly to the realities of bondage. The Bible became more than a sacred text. It became a language through which enslaved people interpreted their own condition. Moses became a symbol of liberation. Pharaoh became a symbol of oppression. The promised land became a symbol of freedom. The Jordan River became a symbol of transition and transformation. What makes the spirituals remarkable is their layered meaning. A song could speak of heaven while also speaking of freedom. A song could express religious faith while also expressing political aspiration. A song could comfort mourners while also encouraging resistance. The spirituals often communicated on multiple levels simultaneously. This symbolic richness gave them extraordinary power. They became sacred songs. They became political songs. They became historical songs. They became freedom songs, all at once. Many of the spirituals flourished within what historians have called the invisible institution. This term refers to the informal religious gatherings organized by enslaved African Americans outside the direct control of overseers and slaveholders. These gatherings often took place in cabins, forests, clearings, and brush arbors. People gathered at great risk. They gathered after exhausting days of labor. They gathered because they needed spaces where their humanity could breathe. Within these gatherings, religion became something more than doctrine. It became experience. It became community. It became survival. Prayer, testimony, preaching, singing, and collective worship combined into a powerful spiritual culture. The spirituals occupied a central place within this world. These songs carried theological ideas, but they also carried emotional truths. They expressed grief. They expressed longing. They expressed joy. They expressed endurance. They expressed hope. The invisible institution became a site of healing, a site of collective affirmation, a site of cultural continuity, a site of resistance. And music stood at the center of it all. The spirituals reminded enslaved people that they were more than what the plantation said that they were. More than labor, more than property, more than instruments of production. They were human beings. They were children of God. They were members of a community. They were bearers of dignity. This affirmation mattered. It mattered spiritually. It mattered psychologically. It mattered politically. It mattered culturally. Because before freedom could become a social reality, it first had to become a moral and spiritual possibility. And when the drum was forbidden, the foot remembered. When the language was broken, the breath remembered. When the family was scattered, the song remembered. This is how a people survive. They place tomorrow inside a melody and pass it hand to hand, mouth to mouth, generation to generation, like a small flame crossing a storm. You know, the first music I ever heard and loved was Black Sacred Song. And for me in my own musical life, the spirituals are central. I mean, they're so foundational, so essential to my conception of music. And I can remember, the first time hearing Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, or Steal Away, or Go Down Moses, or Wade in the Water. Whew, what about Deep River? And then can anybody not feel something whenever you feel Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child? What about Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen? Oh, come on. You couldn't tell me that the enslaved ancestors were not geniuses.
Oh, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus. Nobody knows.
Perhaps the most extraordinary achievement of the spirituals lies in their capacity to hold sorrow and hope together. Many traditions choose one or the other. The spirituals insist on both. They do not deny suffering. They name it. They do not deny grief. They acknowledge it. They do not deny injustice. They confront it. But they refuse to allow suffering, grief, or injustice to define the entirety of their existence. This tension gives the spirituals their distinctive emotional power. They inhabit the space between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be, between captivity and freedom, between despair and possibility, between crucifixion and resurrection. The spirituals became forms of collective healing. They allowed communities to process trauma together, to mourn together, to hope together, to survive together. Long before psychologists spoke of resilience, the spirituals were cultivating resilience. Long before scholars discussed collective trauma, the spirituals were creating collective practices of healing. Long before social theorists analyzed community formation, the spirituals were building community through song. This is why the spirituals remain relevant. They speak not only to the history of slavery, they speak to the broader human struggle to transform suffering into meaning, to transform pain into purpose, to transform wounds into wisdom, to transform memory into movement. The spirituals remind us that survival is not enough. Human beings also need beauty. Human beings also need meaning. Human beings also need hope. And sometimes hope arrives not as an argument, not as policy, not as a speech. Sometimes hope arrives as a song. Over the last several weeks, as I've been preparing to record this episode of the podcast on the spirituals, I have had the spirituals in heavy rotation. And in particular, I keep coming back to There Is a Balm in Gilead. I keep coming back to Were You There? Every time I feel the Spirit. Children, go where I send thee. Mary, don't you weep. I'm troubled in mind. I could just go on. I mean, I remember growing up hearing my grandmothers, both of them, sing songs like Follow the Drinking Gourd and Oh Freedom. And then, of course, my grandmother, who is 99 years old, her grandmother actually experienced Juneteenth down in Texas. And I remember my grandmother, first time I ever heard my grandmother sing No More Auction Block for Me. No more auction block for me. And my grandmother says that her grandmother taught her that song. I was an emotional wreck, you know. I can remember my grandmother's also singing Many Thousands Gone. Oh, freedom over me. The gospel train. Keep your hand on the plow, also known as hold on. What about ride on, King Jesus? Let us break bread together, and then fare ye well. Fare ye well. We talking about the spirituals today, y'all. And so now, I want to talk about the spirituals as a kind of sonic signature, as the sound of a people. If the spirituals carried the history of a people, they also carried a distinctive musical language. To understand the spirituals solely through their lyrics is to hear only part of the story. The music itself matters. The sound matters. The rhythm matters. The performance matters. The voice matters. The spirituals were not simply texts set to melody. They were living, breathing communal experiences. Many spirituals were performed without instruments. The human voice occupied center stage. A single voice might begin a line. The community would answer. The leader would testify. The congregation would respond. The song would unfold as a conversation, as dialogue, as relationship. This pattern of call and response reflected more than musical structure. It reflected a philosophy of community, the beloved community. Nobody stood alone. Nobody sang alone. The individual voice gained strength through collective participation. The collective voice gained richness through individual contribution. The spirituals also embraced repetition. Lines returned again and again. Phrases circled back on themselves, but repetition never meant stagnation. Each repetition created opportunities for improvisation, embellishment, reinterpretation, and emotional intensification. A repeated phrase became deeper each time it returned. A familiar line became newly meaningful. The song lived because it changed. The song survived because it adapted. The song endured because it remained open to human creativity. This openness would later become a defining feature of blues, jazz, gospel, soul, funk, reggae, and rap music. The spirituals established artistic principles that continue to shape African American and African diasporic music today. Communal participation, improvisation, emotional authenticity, rhythmic vitality, collective creation. The genealogy of Black popular music is impossible to understand without understanding the spirituals. They are the musical Rosetta Stone of Black popular music. The sacred singers remain with us, not as relics, not as ghosts, but as companions. They stand at the edge of every unfinished struggle, reminding us that dignity can survive domination, that beauty can emerge from broken ground, that memory can become movement, that community can become power. And when the night grows heavy with its familiar burdens, their voices arrive again, not to erase the darkness, but to teach us how to walk through it, singing. The spirituals emerged within a system designed to deny freedom. But freedom appears everywhere within the tradition. Sometimes freedom appears directly, sometimes symbolically, sometimes spiritually, sometimes politically, often all at once. One of the most remarkable features of the spirituals is their capacity to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. A song could express religious longing and political aspiration in the same breath. A song could speak about heaven while also speaking about liberation on earth. A song could comfort the weary while encouraging resistance. Biblical imagery proved especially important. The Exodus narrative occupied a central place in the spiritual imagination of the enslaved. The Israelites' bondage in Egypt resonated deeply with enslaved African Americans. Moses became a symbol of leadership and liberation. Pharaoh became a symbol of oppression. The Promised Land became a symbol of freedom. The Jordan River became a symbol of transition from one condition of existence to another. The genius of the spirituals lies in their symbolic flexibility. Their meanings could travel. Their meanings could deepen. Their meanings could adapt to changing circumstances. What remained constant was the conviction that oppression was not ultimate. The spirituals rejected the idea that domination possessed final authority. The songs insisted that another world was possible, a freer world, a world more just, a more humane world. In this sense, the spirituals helped cultivate what might be called democratic imagination. They encouraged people to envision realities that did not yet exist. They nurtured aspirations larger than present circumstances. They kept hope alive. Not passive hope, active hope. Hope disciplined by struggle. Hope sustained through community. Hope carried through song.
Don't you know I'm packing? Yes, I'm packing. No, 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 I know.
One of the great ironies of the spirituals tradition is that many spirituals survived because individuals recognized their importance at a moment when others dismissed them. Following the Civil War, African American intellectuals, educators, musicians, and community leaders worked to preserve a tradition that had largely been transmitted orally. Collections of spirituals began to appear. Scholars and musicians documented songs that otherwise might have been lost. But preservation also raised difficult questions. How could a living tradition be documented without freezing it? How could oral performance be translated into written notation? How could communal expression be represented on a printed page? These questions remain important today. Among the most significant institutions in the preservation and dissemination of the spirituals was Fisk University. Founded in Nashville, Tennessee, after the Civil War, Fisk became one of the nation's leading historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs. In 1871, a group of Fisk students embarked on a concert tour that would transform the history of the spirituals. They became known as the Fisk Jubilee Singers. The significance of the Fisk Jubilee Singers cannot be overstated. At a time when racist stereotypes dominated public perceptions of black life, these young women and men introduced audiences throughout the United States and Europe to the beauty, sophistication, and emotional power of the spiritual tradition. Their performances helped raise funds for Fisk University. Their performances challenged prevailing assumptions about African American culture. Their performances brought spirituals to audiences far beyond the communities in which they originated. The Jubilee Singers demonstrated that the spirituals were not merely regional folk expressions. These were works of artistic significance, works of cultural significance, works of national significance, works of global significance. Through their efforts, the spirituals entered concert halls, educational institutions, and international cultural discourse. The songs of enslaved people became part of the world's musical heritage. The story of the spirituals does not end with the 19th century. In many ways, it begins there. The spirituals stand at the root of an extraordinary musical genealogy. Consider gospel music, one of my favorites. The spirituals' emphasis on collective worship, emotional expression, testimony, call and response, and sacred affirmation profoundly shaped 20th century gospel traditions. Consider the blues. Although often presented as a secular counterpart to sacred music, the blues inherited expressive techniques, vocal practices, improvisational approaches, and emotional depth from earlier spiritual traditions. The sacred and the secular were never entirely separate. They remained intertwined. Each informed the other. Consider jazz. Improvisation, collective creativity, call and response, rhythmic innovation. These elements connect jazz to earlier African American musical traditions, including the spirituals. Consider rhythm and blues, soul, funk, rap. Across these genres, we continue to hear echoes of the Black sacred song tradition reaching back to the spirituals. The preacher's cadence, the testimonial voice, the collective chorus, the struggle for freedom, the affirmation of dignity, the insistence on humanity. The spirituals establish foundational patterns that continue to reverberate across African American music, if not African diasporian music. Indeed, one might say that every major African American musical genre carries traces of the spiritual tradition. The forms evolve, the contexts change, the technologies transform, but the deeper currents remain. Memory, community, creativity, freedom. These currents continue to flow. The spirituals were never merely sorrow. History is too careless when it says that. Yes, grief lived there. The grief of children sold south. The grief of mothers counting absences. The grief of names dissolved in ledgers and shipping records. But grief was only one instrument. Hope stood beside it. Defiance stood beside it. A stubborn, unembarrassed faith stood beside it. The kind of faith that does not deny suffering, but walks through it carrying water. The kind of faith that knows the sea can be crossed, the desert can be crossed, the century can be crossed. The singers looked toward Jordan. They also looked toward tomorrow. They sang of heaven, but they also sang of earth. They sang of deliverance, but they also rehearsed freedom before freedom arrived. What is democracy if not a chorus? What is liberation if not many voices discovering their strength together? The leader calls, the people answer. The people call, history answers. We should be clear about something. The spirituals did not disappear with emancipation. They continued to inspire subsequent generations engaged in struggles for freedom. Their influence can be heard throughout the Black freedom movement. During the 20th century, spirituals and spiritual-inspired songs became integral to the struggle for civil rights. The freedom songs of the modern civil rights movement drew directly from the spiritual tradition. Activists adapted older melodies, reworked familiar lyrics, created new expressions of collective determination. The relationship between spirituals and social movements reveals an important truth. Music does not merely reflect history. Music helps to make history. Music can sustain movements. Music can strengthen communities. Music can nurture courage. Music can transform fear into action. Throughout African American history, music has frequently functioned as a repository of democratic aspiration. The spirituals stand among the earliest and most influential examples of this tradition. They remind us that democracy is not simply a political system. Democracy is also a cultural practice, a moral practice, a communal practice, a way of imagining relationships among human beings. The spirituals helped cultivate precisely this kind of imagination. They affirmed shared humanity. They affirmed collective responsibility. They affirmed the possibility of transformation. All right, so now we've come upon a couple of key questions. What relevance do the spirituals possess today? Why should contemporary audiences continue to engage this tradition? The answer begins with memory. The spirituals preserve histories that might otherwise be forgotten. They remind us of the resilience, creativity, and humanity of those who endured slavery. They remind us that African American history is not solely a history of oppression. It is also a history of cultural creation, a history of intellectual innovation, a history of artistic achievement, a history of spiritual imagination. The spirituals also remain relevant because the questions they address remain relevant. How do communities survive adversity? How do people maintain dignity amid dehumanization? How do they build solidarity? How do they sustain hope? How do they continue struggling for justice when progress appears uncertain? These questions remain with us. The spirituals offer no easy answers, but they offer wisdom. They offer perspective. They offer resources for reflection. In an era marked by polarization, inequality, displacement, ecological crisis, and democratic uncertainty, the spirituals remind us of the enduring importance of community, courage, memory, and hope. They remind us that human beings are capable of creating beauty even under difficult circumstances. They remind us that culture can become a source of survival. They remind us that music, sweet music, can help carry people through history. All throughout this episode, you've been hearing excerpts of my new piece, my new poem called The Sacred Singers Remain With Us. The Sacred Singers Remain With Us. And this is, I've written it or tried to the best of my humble abilities, to write this particular poem in the style of the spirituals, created by, sung by, composed and produced by the enslaved ancestors. And I'm not going to give you a long preface today because the spirit has descended in here in the studio. And I just want to share, my mute tribute to the ancestors. This is called The Sacred Singers Remain with Us. Before the road had a name, before the nation learned its own contradictions, before freedom was a promise printed on paper and denied in practice, there was a voice. Not a single voice, a gathering of voices, a field becoming a choir, a wound becoming a witness. The song rose where iron believed itself eternal. It rose where cotton drank the daylight, and the body bent toward the earth, while the spirit leaned elsewhere, toward horizons no overseer could fence. Listen. Not with the ear alone, but with that older chamber of knowing, where memory sleeps lightly, where ancestors keep watch like lamps hung at a distance, away from bad weather. The song says, I am older than this plantation, older than this auction block, older than the language that names me property. I arrived carrying rivers. I arrived carrying drums hidden in bone. I arrived carrying stories folded inside the dark bread of memory. And when the drum was forbidden, the foot remembered. When the language was broken, the breath remembered. When the family was scattered, the song remembered. This is how a people survive. They place tomorrow inside a melody and pass it hand to hand, mouth to mouth, generation to generation, like a small flame crossing a storm. The sacred singers remain with us, not as relics, not as ghosts, but as companions. They stand at the edge of every unfinished struggle, reminding us that dignity can survive domination, that beauty can emerge from broken ground, that memory can become movement, that community can become power. And when the night grows heavy with its familiar burdens, their voices arrive again, not to erase the darkness, but to teach us how to walk through it, singing. The spirituals were never merely sorrow. History is too careless when it says that. Yes, grief lived there. The grief of children sold south. The grief of mothers counting absences. The grief of names dissolved in ledgers and shipping records. But grief was only one instrument. Hope stood beside it. Defiance stood beside it. A stubborn, unembarrassed faith stood beside it. The kind of faith that does not deny suffering, but walks through it carrying water. The kind of faith that knows the sea can be crossed, the desert can be crossed, the century can be crossed. The singers looked toward Jordan, but they also looked toward tomorrow. They sang of heaven, but they also sang of earth. They sang of deliverance, but they also rehearsed freedom before freedom arrived. What is democracy, if not a chorus? What is liberation, if not many voices discovering their strength together? The leader calls, the people answers. The people call, history answers. The old pattern continues, even now, in storefront churches, in freedom marches, in jazz clubs, in classrooms, in poems, in protest chants, in the trembling testimony of someone refusing despair. The song keeps traveling, changing clothes, changing tempo, changing instruments, but carrying the same deep current. You can hear it bending through blues. You can hear it testifying through gospel. You can hear it improvising through jazz. You can hear it electrifying soul. You can hear it bumping and funk bass lines. You can hear it speaking in samples, break beats, and rhymes. The song never disappeared. It learned new routes because freedom is not a destination. Freedom is a practice, a reaching, a remembering, a returning to the sacred fact that every human life exceeds the systems arranged against it. And so the sacred singers remain with us, not as relics, not as ghosts, but as companions. They stand at the edge of every unfinished struggle, reminding us that dignity can survive domination, that beauty can emerge from broken ground, that memory can become movement, that community can become power. And when the night grows heavy with its familiar burdens, their voices arrive again, not to erase the darkness, but to teach us. To teach us. I said, to teach us how to walk through it, walk through the night, walk through the long and cold and dark night, singing sorrow songs, but also songs of celebration. Ooh, the sacred singers remain with us. Yeah, I believe that. I'm gonna wrap things up here, let you go. I appreciate you spending some time with us. Time is so precious. So, as we conclude, let us return to the larger significance of the spirituals. The spirituals emerged from enslavement. They are the art that emerged from enslavement, but they were never reducible to enslavement. They emerged from oppression, but they were never defined solely by oppression. They emerged from suffering, but they transformed suffering into something larger than suffering. They transformed it into art, into memory, into faith, into community, into hope. The spirituals stand at the beginning of a long and remarkable history of African American music. Before gospel, there were spirituals. Before blues, there were spirituals. Before jazz, there were spirituals. Before rhythm and blues, folk, soul, funk, disco, house, rap music, and countless other forms, there were spirituals. The spirituals helped establish a musical vocabulary that continues to shape American culture and global culture. They remind us that Black music has never been merely entertainment. Black music has often functioned as philosophy, as theology, as historical memory, as political commentary, as communal practice, as democratic possibility. The spirituals teach us that creativity can flourish even under conditions designed to suppress it. They teach us that culture can become a form of resistance. They teach us that spirituality can become a source of liberation. They teach us that memory can become movement. And they teach us that the struggle for freedom is never solely political. It is also cultural. It is also spiritual. It is also artistic. The spirituals endure because they speak to something fundamental within the human experience. They remind us that dignity survives domination, that hope survives hardship, that community survives fragmentation, that the human spirit, although wounded, remains capable of creating beauty. And perhaps that is their greatest lesson. Not that suffering disappears, but that suffering need not have the final word. The final word belongs to hope. The final word belongs to freedom. The final word belongs to the people who continue to sing. Speaking of singing, I have curated a very special spirituals playlist just for you. Nobody can speak for the ancestors better than they can speak for themselves. Oh, gotta go. Gotta get out of here. I want to thank you for joining me for this episode of The Cause. And I'm your host, Reiland Rabaka. We are trying to build a beloved community with each and every episode of this podcast. And I hope that you will join us and you will join our beloved community program in the Center for African and African American Studies. Until next time, remember, from sorrow songs to freedom songs, from memory to movement, the spirituals still sing.
Thank you for joining us for the Cause podcast with Dr. Reiland Rabaka. For your letters, questions, and suggestions regarding the podcast, email us, thecause@gmail.com. CAAAS. The Cause podcast with Dr. Reiland Rabaka is produced and edited by John Arnold and is a production of the Center for African and African American Studies, The Cause, at the University of Colorado Boulder. For more information, visit us online at colorado.edu/center/cause. CAAAS.
Class is in session, so come and get your lesson. Ooh, the Cause podcast. I love that. Do you love that?